And welcome to Conversations, where every week I, Jason Plotkin, Program Director at Congregation Emanu, talk to a member of our congregation, the community, or perhaps even from the sports world to discuss the current state of affairs. Before we introduce today's guest, I do want to indicate that we are recording this on Monday afternoon. Obviously, everything around us in the world is changing rapidly, so I do want to make note of that. Now, I'd like to welcome our guest today, Chris Harrison, who is a writer and editor for the Audacious Hospitality Division of the Union for Reform Judaism. Chris, welcome to our show.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
All right, Chris, now let's set the stage for our conversation today, and let's get a chance to introduce yourself to our viewers. Please tell us a little bit about your current role with the URJ and some of the hats you wear in this position.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am the writer-editor for Audacious Hospitality on the marketing communications team at the URJ. I write articles and blog posts that are related to topics like anti-racism, LGBTQ plus topics, Torah commentaries, topics, blog posts about Jewish holidays, things like that. I've also been involved with some of the grant report editing process, some marketing materials, collaborations with the Religious Action Center, Women of Reform Judaism, things like that.
Awesome. Now in your bio, it says you are a driven and passionate new convert to Judaism. Tell us a bit about your upbringing, and as someone who's been through the conversion process, what led you towards your decision?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually converted in December 2017. So I don't know if I'm still technically a new convert. Maybe I am in the scheme of things. But yeah, let's just go ahead and say that I am a new convert. But yeah, I grew up actually in the AME Church, which is the African Methodist Episcopal Church, majority Black church. But I became interested in Judaism when I was around the age of 11. And my mom had actually told me that some of our family's partial heritage was actually Jewish because she has German ancestry, and some of the German immigrants that are in her family were apparently Jewish. And I thought that was really cool. And so, but I didn't start seriously exploring Judaism until I was in college. And it was around that time when I made some good friends at college who were Jewish, and I went to one of my good friends' homes for Shabbat dinners on Friday nights, went to Hillel Shabbat services, went to Purim spiels. I had a Shabbat in the Sukkah one night, Hanukkah parties, things like that. I mean, it was sort of like an immersion into Judaism when I was still, doing some other learning in college, and it was just a really cool experience. And I had one meeting with a rabbi when I was in college, the Hillel rabbi at the time at Miami University where I was going to school. And it was a great meeting, but it just also emphasized the fact that I really wasn't ready to convert to a different religion at the time. So it wouldn't be until a couple of years later when I was living in Chicago that I actually took an Intro to Judaism class at Temple Shalom. And I loved it, and it just only reinforced what I had felt those years ago, that this is what I was intended to do. This is who I am as a person. And after I took that, though, my partner and I moved to Michigan, where she got a job, and I joined this community called Temple Bethel, another Reform congregation in the Metro Detroit area, and I finished my conversion there, and I've been a member there ever since.
All right. Well, now you're a Jewish professional, obviously working for the URJ.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell you as a Jewish professional myself that there were several moments that really steered me to the work that I do. And as someone that has a special communication skill, as you do, truly visible in your writing, your spoken word, and it's just something that has all come together, if you will. What was the moment for you where your passion for Judaism and writing came together to really steer you towards the work you're doing right now for the URJ?
So I would say it would actually be when I became a Juvenation Fellow, which is, I'll get into that in a little bit, but it's a leadership development cohort that's run by the Union for Reform Judaism. And when I signed on to be a Juvenation Fellow, it was around that time when I started actually writing for Detroit Jews for Justice. I wrote a blog post for them, which is basically a Jewish social justice oriented nonprofit in Detroit, as the name suggests. And I also wrote a bit for the Detroit Jewish News. And that gave me a sense of fulfillment, and it gave me a sense of weaving the two parts of my identity together as a writer and as someone who is Jewish. And it was a really cool experience. And then not too long after that, actually, it was only like a couple months later that I actually signed on as a writer editor at the URJ. And that just added to the sense of fulfillment and reinforced my feeling that I was where I was supposed to be. I'm supposed to be communicating what's on my mind and on my heart in a way that reaches audiences, and both manages to engage with them and entertain them, but also teach them something.
Wow. And as someone personally, and you and I have kind of exchanged my writing with you, you've seen some of my writing.
And you're a fantastic writer, I should say.
Well, thank you. I have a passion too, and I completely understand where you're coming from. I mean, when you can feel like you're writing something and you can engage an audience and tell a story, it really is powerful for you as a person to share that message. And you, in your last answer, brought up the JewV'Nation Fellowship. When I bring guests onto the show, I really like to dive into something they might not be aware about as it relates to an organization, an entity. And the JewV'Nation Fellowship, which you are part of starting in 2018, is really fascinating. Can you tell our guests what that fellowship is, what you got out of it, and the impact it made on you as a person?
In short, the JewV'Nation Fellowship was fantastic. But yeah, so it's basically a leadership development program for Jewish leaders across North America. And I was basically a part of a group that was involved with professional leadership development. And basically the goal with that was to expand the field of Jewish leaders in the Reform movement and even beyond just the Reform movement. And yeah, the cohort that I was in was the Jews of Color cohort. And one of the best moments, I would say, of being within that cohort was actually the welcome retreat that we held about I would say a month into actually joining the fellowship, because I communicated with a lot of the other people in the fellowship over Zoom meetings, actually. And while that was great getting to know them in that capacity, it still felt kind of impersonal because we were, just talking behind computer screens, which frankly a lot of people are getting used to right now. But it wasn't until actually going to that retreat and getting to know people in person and just being in the same rooms with them. It was incredible. And it was the fact that I was able to be in the same room with so many other Jews of color who went through so many similar experiences that I faced as somebody who's a Jew of color. And just with people and with a diverse backgrounds within that cohort itself. It was just incredible. I keep telling people that it was so nice being able to be in a space, in a Jewish space, where I didn't have to explain who I was based on how I looked. It was just assumed that I was where I was supposed to be, and there was a sense of understanding that we all shared, and it was just incredible.
Wow. And, as a father of a Jew of color, I really think about that a lot, and, of the resources that are out there, like B'chol Lashon, which does a camp for Jews of color. I mean, it's really something that I think about and trying to expose my son to, since both my wife and I are white, that it's important that he be exposed to other Jews of color. So I appreciate your insight into that. And, speaking of what's going on currently in the world, we're faced with the COVID pandemic. We're also faced with a lot of conversations about race. And let's lead off with the COVID pandemic, if you will. We know that people of color are impacted at a much higher rate than white people with the COVID pandemic due to the bias in the medical community and access to health care. You're in Michigan, so Detroit has definitely seen an increase. New Orleans, where I've spent some time, has seen significant impact during the COVID pandemic. But what is the way that we can advocate and support those who are in need of our help at this difficult time as it relates to, people of color being impacted and access to the health care that they need?
So in short, the best thing I can say is to speak up and act. And, don't don't think that race isn't a factor in this, which I know you know because you just acknowledged it, but don't listen to I've noticed that frankly there have been some white people on social media who have shared this quote that Morgan Freeman said from a couple years ago when he was asked by someone on 60 Minutes, how do we stop racism? And he said, stop talking about it. Just, talk to me as if I'm just a person. And on the surface, that sounds great because, the ultimate goal is equality. But what that statement does is whether and I doubt he intended it this way, but it erases our experiences when you stop talking about racism and when you don't bring race into the equation, because race is something that I've had to carry on my back my entire life, and I can't just pretend it doesn't exist because it very much does exist. And people who are suffering and can't get access to the same healthcare that white people do, they can't pretend that race doesn't exist. So first of all, acknowledge that, and then just learn more about it. Learn about the discrepancies in healthcare that Black people receive compared to white people. And while I'm not necessarily an expert on this topic, I do know that there are different resources out there that can speak more broadly about this. I know the Century Foundation, the director of healthcare reform at the Century Foundation, Jamila Taylor, I believe is her name. She wrote an interesting piece about it that has some fantastic resources that can talk a little bit more about what the problem is and how to get to where I think the majority of us want to get to, is a place of equity and true equality. And I would also say, in the meantime, also continue donating to local and national nonprofits that help people of color and help Black people. Also, simply just reach out to people of color that who are struggling right now, and just be that person who's willing to listen, because sometimes that's all it takes. And then obviously acting on whatever they need or suggest, of course, but the very act of reaching out goes a long way. And further, if you have the power to do so, and I'm willing to bet a lot of people watching this do, start initiatives at your synagogue or your community to get the ball rolling on these things, and to reach out to people in the wider community and ask, what can we do to make things a little bit better? What dent can we make in the community?
We're going to, in a little bit, talk about what people can do in the synagogue specifically, and then with our Jewish organizations. But, you brought up the Morgan Freeman quote, and it's interesting because I have a hard time processing that while there's a strong reaction now, obviously, to the circumstances surrounding George Floyd in particular, which kind of initiated a lot of this, that's led to protest and statements from so many entities and more, that we've been here before, right? And that
Yes.
things will eventually quiet down, and maybe they won't for a little while longer than usual because of the COVID pandemic and just the state of where we are. But suffice to say, there will be another George Floyd. What can we do to avoid this vicious cycle and keep this conversation relevant?
Excuse me. One thing I would suggest is basically getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. Always be in the mode of asking, what can we and what can I as an individual be doing better? And then once you've figured that out, act on it. And part of that involves getting people of color in on the discussion, getting Black people in on the discussion. Like if there is, a presence in your synagogue of people of color, reach out to them and ask them to collaborate, and I know some people might be worried about, like, well, I don't want to make them uncomfortable or inadvertently tokenize them, but there is a difference between tokenization and inclusion. Tokenization is just to like reach a quota or to check something off of, a checklist or whatever, but active inclusion means again, like I said, being a little bit comfortable with being uncomfortable and asking, where have we failed? What can we do better? We can't do this without you. We need you as an equal partner in this, to do the things that we're wanting to do, and keep the pressure on, your lay leaders, clergy, board members, to keep these initiatives rolling. I mean, because you're right. Like, this is something that is often turned into a vicious cycle. We get outraged, that outrage dies down, we move on to the next one. but actually keeping yourself accountable in that way and keeping up the perpetual asking of the question, what can we continue to do better? Where are we dropping the ball? It's not going to be fun asking yourself that. It's never fun to self-criticize, but it's vital. It's absolutely vital.
Well, I appreciate that response, and I appreciate the resources and suggestions that you've already presented. And along those lines, I think something that resonates with any conversation for an ongoing issue is the fact that what do we envision change looking like, in the coming week or two, coming weeks, and then let's say 3 to 5 years. I mean, what should we strive for that change to look like, and what steps can we take to get to that change?
So it's a little hard to say what I envision, exactly what an equitable future is going to look like within the next 3 to 5 years and beyond. But here's what I will say. I do want a future where I can walk into any synagogue or a JCC or a Jewish networking event or what have you, and have people not mistake me for maintenance staff, or think I'm another Jew of color, or ask me if I'm related to so and so who I've never met in a day in my life, or what have you. I envision a future where the stories and experiences of Jews of color are not just taken as like one-off little anecdotes that we can just kind of brush to the side and like, oh well, that doesn't affect the majority of Jews, so we can just kind of ignore it. No, this affects Jews. It doesn't matter what the percentage of Jews of color are. If something is affecting Jews and they are directly affecting us, then it's important. Take us seriously, take our stories and experiences seriously, and check your implicit biases to see like why did I think this person was somebody else? Why did I think that this person was part of maintenance staff? And basically go from there. I think, to answer your question, I want a future where I can just be Jewish and be a Jew of color and celebrate that part of me, but not just have to continually explain who I am every time I enter a Jewish space.
And now, we're going to take a turn towards talking about synagogues. Obviously, I work at a synagogue. You work for an employer who has 900 plus synagogues of all shapes and sizes, different cities, different towns, all sorts of different demographics, if you will, as relates to age and where people are in life. But one of the challenges that I think synagogues have in determining what they can do to make themselves more welcoming to people, and you kind of alluded to this. My wife shared the term with me, ashkenormative, because there's an assumption that this is what Jews look like. I mean, what is the challenge to getting to that utopia that in some ways you mentioned, where you just want to be a Jew? I mean, what's the key in meeting that challenge so you could walk in and have that experience that you so desperately want to see?
I think it's important to realize that that term you brought up, ashkenormative, it connects to this very like bizarre idea that's rooted frankly in American nostalgia about what Judaism is. Like when people think, when a lot of white Jews think about Judaism, they tend to think of like, bubbies and zadies in the 50s and briskets and challah and things like that. And that is very much a part of American Judaism, but that's not the whole story. It's not even close to it. And when people read about or hear about Jews of color, like I said before, we're often treated as one-offs or like something that is really not part of like the main Jewish story, and we can afford to ignore it. Like when people think that the only black Jews there are the ones that live in Ethiopia, you have a problem. And that's as beautiful as those communities are, obviously. I mean, that's not the full extent of the Jewish story, the Jew of color story. And it's important to understand that. And I want to plug Alana Kaufman's study that she released last year, the Counting Inconsistencies study that she did with the Jews of Color Field Building Initiative. And I apologize, you might see a cameo from my cat in my lap.
Hey, I have a cat here. I completely my viewers and David Tanner, who's behind the scenes, completely are used to my cat, so it's all good.
Yeah, he loves being on camera. But no, she released a study last year that basically said that Jews of color are an estimated 12 to 15% of the U.S. Jewish population, and that is an estimate. Frankly, because the way that we've been counting Jews, not just Jews of color, but Jews in general, is severely flawed. I mean, you can go into a little bit more of her story, like on the Jews of Color Field Building Initiative website. But essentially, people were doing anything from just looking up Jewish-sounding names in the phone book to doing things like I've had people who are statisticians and demographers and stuff look at some of these studies and just think like, how did this even happen? And so it's not just Jews of color that are being failed, it's Jews in general. But because of that, Jews of color were very much undercounted. And I think it's important to address that. Why were they undercounted? In what ways were they undercounted? And just basically just going from there.
You had earlier brought up being uncomfortable. And you had a quote in a recent story that you wrote about from Jordan Berg Powers, where about the need for souls to have time to be uncomfortable, especially if we're sitting comfortable. What, we talk about this amongst our lay leadership, about being an inclusive synagogue. But what do synagogue leaders, both staff and lay, need to possess to be able to have those uncomfortable conversations?
The main thing I'll say to that is that Judaism, a big part of Judaism, is about being uncomfortable, right? I mean, it kind of is. Like we as a people are perpetually uncomfortable. We cannot ever sit in just one place. We're constantly, I mean, the phrase "the wandering Jew," right? Like, and we're a people that we have these really intense conversations with one another. That's our entire history. I mean, the Talmud alone is just one long, like, back and forth argument. It's beautiful because of that. I mean, that's I would say a major part of who we are. So why are we so uncomfortable talking about this? This is just another thing. I mean, it's a thing that, like, we've addressed so many other things within the Jewish world. How is race any different? If anything, this is something we should be taking, head on. But I think part of it, and I think this goes beyond just Judaism and people in general, is that we don't like being called bad people, and we don't like when we feel like we are not doing something good enough, because a lot of us, so many of us, take criticism so personally. And when someone says what you said was racist, or what you said was sexist or homophobic, biphobic, transphobic, what have you, you know, it hurts. And even I'll admit, like, if I commit a microaggression without thinking about it, it hurts, because I think, oh my God, am I a bad person? What am I going to do? This person's never going to forgive me. But at the end of the day, it's like, it's just something we have to work through. I'm going to keep saying this. We have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And part of that is recognizing that when people talk about these experiences that they've had in Jewish communities, when they've had microaggressions, when they've had racist experiences, we're allowed to have feelings of, like, guilt and shame and sadness about that. We just can't let them be the forefront of what we're doing. We have to take people's stories and elevate them above our feelings. And that is, I think, the main thing that people need to just do. I mean, like, if you're, like, say you're in a meeting that's about, like, anti-racism or social justice or whatever, and somebody in the meeting who is a Black person brings up a painful story, if like, and say you're a white person, you're allowed to be sad about it, and and process these feelings. You have to draw a boundary by not placing your feelings above what they said. If you have to leave the room and cry, leave the room and cry. If you have to process these feelings with a white person after the meeting, so you don't place the burden on the Black person about how you're feeling, do that. Talk about these things with, like, your white colleagues. That's okay. You just have to find that line and stay there. And ultimately, we have to do this, because I don't think I'm I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say the fate of Judaism depends on this, because there are an estimated 12 to 15% Jews of color. That number is going to keep growing. just like the amount of people of color in general are going to keep growing, that stat is going to move along with it. And so because of that, we cannot afford to have communities that still latch on to this weird nostalgia and this racism, even unintended racism. And so we have to know what's on the line. And further, and I'll sort of end your question with this. Speaking of Jews being an uncomfortable people, we're told, what is it, 36 times in the Torah alone to pursue justice?
Right.
That seems like a lot, right? I mean, if we're told to do something 36 times in 5 books, it seems like we should do it. And part of that is pursuing justice. We're told to do it 36 times because it's not easy and feelings are going to arise. But we've been through a lot before. I think we can get over some hurt feelings.
Wow, that was again another powerful response with a lot of things to take away, especially as individuals in our community process and have these conversations, whether it's at my synagogue or any individual synagogue. But my last question, and we kind of brushed on this earlier, but I really want to end this conversation today with one takeaway for our viewers, something I personally want them to take back to their communities. If you could give a suggestion or a few about what we should commit to as members of the Jewish community in the short term specifically, to not let the memory of George Floyd and all of those taken by racism be for naught, what would that be?
So one thing I'll say is I'll just reiterate a lot of what I said earlier about keep asking what we keep doing better, include people of color, take what we're saying seriously, keep the pressure on yourselves and on your white colleagues and to keep moving forward with things, even when we don't want to, especially when we don't want to. But also in the short term, just I would say for one, to plug some stuff at the URJ, look at our Audacious Hospitality Toolkit, frankly. There is a lot of knowledge in there, a lot of great starting points that I think congregations can really get a lot out of, and questions to ask ourselves and one another, like in meetings and things like that. That's an excellent resource. And speaking of the toolkit, we actually made a new version of the congregational assessment that we had in the toolkit, and we've titled the community assessment, that we actually just made live a couple days ago. And you can download that and get the ball rolling on asking yourself some difficult questions, like, for instance, questions related to general audacious hospitality, related to your synagogue's inclusion efforts for the LGBTQ plus community, anti-racism, of course, disabilities inclusion, things like that. And so in the short term, again, get comfortable with being uncomfortable, asking yourselves and one another these questions, and giving an honest assessment of where you're at as a community, even when you don't like the answer, especially when you don't like the answer. So if you're taking the assessment and you're seeing a lot of no answers or a lot of answers you don't like, that shows you, it shows you where you can go from there. It's like, yeah, we failed in these areas or these areas, but there is a long way you can go now. And it's up to you to figure out how we can get there. And again, it's through learning and collaboration, and just staying perpetually uncomfortable and liking every second of it.
For those who are interested, the resources that Chris just brought up, we will include in the Facebook and on the YouTube, for those who want to learn more about those resources. And of course, the URJ is continually putting out resources, also through the Religious Action Center as well. Chris, is there anything you'd like to add, or any other resources that you would like to share before we close this time that you can think of?
No, it's just been, an honor to talk with you and to teach people, a little bit about where I'm coming from with this. And I love our Jewish community so much. And, I know that I know that we can, as a community, like as individual communities and as a community at large, tackle racism, tackle all forms of injustice, and we can do it together. And I am, despite everything that's been happening these last few weeks, and it has been a hellish past few weeks, I it's like I've told one of my colleagues, my hope is just too stubborn. I refuse to give up on this, and I want to keep holding other people in my community accountable because I love them, and I just want to keep moving forward.
And for me personally, you've read my story. I want to keep moving forward. For Isaac, my 4-year-old African-American son, a Jew of color, who many of our congregants might be familiar with, but a lot of people aren't familiar with the story, and hopefully we'll be able to share that before long. But to continue building on what Chris is talking about, just note that as a congregation, Congregation Emanu will actually be taking advantage of some of the resources. The URJ's Jews of Color video that they put together, there'll be a film and a discussion with Rabbi Hayon and Stephanie Carlson, Wednesday, June 17th at 7:30. That's today if you're watching this when it airs. And Friday, June 19th at 12:30 p.m. The Zoom links and the other information is available on the Emanu website. Chris, I'd like to thank you again for coming on. Thank David Tanner, both of our cats, I guess I should mention, for their role and their visibility. And then for those who would like to tune in next week, we're going to continue the conversation with the URJ. Amy Asen, who is the Vice President of Strengthening Congregations, will join us next Wednesday at 12 p.m. Chris, again, thank you for coming on. All of our friends who are watching, thank you. David Tanner, again, thank you. And we hope you'll join us next Wednesday at 12 p.m. for Amy Asen on Facebook and on our website. Take care, everybody, and have a great day.